They're not therapists by training. One or two have a license, but most of them aren't, and they're not inclined particularly in that direction. They're kind of, well, let's see what you do with this. Let's see. After the journey, we'll do some debriefing, but if you need ongoing counseling, I'll refer you out. But what I'm looking for, if I'm speaking for one of the women, they're looking for a change in your life, in what you bring back to the community and do differently in your own life, and what contribution you're called to make. So they have a whole different perspective than just reducing symptoms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that showcases long-form, unedited conversations on topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship. We are leaving behind something vital in our effort to medicalize and institutionalize psychedelics. We're leaving behind the voices of wisdom coming from the psychedelic underground, those who have been journeying themselves and working with clients, those who have sat in apprenticeship with others who have journeyed and explored and been working with psychedelics for even longer. There are many reasons for the exclusion of these voices, some of which being directly from the underground guides themselves, who obviously aren't intending to speak very publicly due to the legality of the work that they're doing. Other reasons being a bit more political, as above-ground researchers and business people are trying not to sully, quote, sully their image with any association with illegal or underground psychedelic use. And even other reasons a lot more murky, such as slowing down to listen to wisdom can really cut into the potential profits of putting a product to market ahead of the big wave. Irrespective of reason, though, these voices are being left behind, and in doing so, the narrative landscape of psychedelics today is often hollowed out as it merely echoes back and forth between competing profit interests, sensationalized headlines, and efforts to mainstream with a posturing palatable to powers and institutions that in many ways are antithetical to the very lessons psychedelics call us to learn. Certainly, the underground is being spoken about, although often only in respect to the potential harms or abuses coming from underground providers. This is truthful, but in some respects it's half-truthful and a very narrow window into the depth and richness of the work being done in the psychedelic underground since their emergence into the West 70 years ago. Thankfully, someone was willing to find these voices, especially women's voices, listen, and then share the wisdom learned there into the public conversation, sharing that wisdom well contextualized in the modern psychedelic research and medicine landscape. That person is Rachel Harris, and she's amplifying these voices in her new book, Swimming in the Sacred. Rachel Harris is a psychologist who has been in private practice for 40 years. She spent 10 years in an academic research department where she published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals and received a National Institutes of Health New Investigators Award. She's also the author of Listening to Ayahuasca and has been on the podcast here twice, once to discuss about the topics of that previous book, Listening to Ayahuasca, and the other one as a part of a psychedelic cafe titled What Psychedelics Can Teach Us About Dealing with Crisis. In this episode, we explore swimming in the sacred, the various elements that Harris learned from these underground guides and where it compares, complements, and contrasts the prevailing narratives around psychedelic medicine presently at the forefront of the so-called psychedelic renaissance. This includes discussion on the value of the wisdom of women guides specifically, working with unseen worlds and unseen others, thin veils absorption and being accidentally overdosed by psychedelics, the uncanny connection between guide and journeyer during ceremony, and how therapy and guiding are two separate skills. Furthermore, we talk about the complexity of good dosing, the value of lower doses, and the risks of putting larger doses on a pedestal, the strange phenomenon of competitive ego deathing, a term I accidentally coined during this interview, and learning to work with life in a bigger way by learning to let our psychedelic insights work on us over time. We talk about the harms and abuse of both under and above ground psychedelic therapy, the difference between certification and qualification, how we lose our capacity to properly skill psychedelic guides in a rush to certify as many as possible to meet a massive demand, and why psychedelic therapists need to have experienced psychedelics themselves. As always, a full episode content breakdown is available with timestamps in the description to this episode, wherever you're listening to it, or if you are watching it on YouTube. Also, as always, this podcast is brought to you by listeners like you. This is my full-time work. This is my primary income stream, and it's listeners like yourself that make that possible. And so a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people who are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out, as well as everyone who's left one-time donations. If you're listening to this and you're finding value in it, you're enjoying this content, please do consider supporting the show financially. Again, this is my primary area of work. This is my primary revenue stream. My primary income is earned by doing this work. So if you are finding value in this work, if you're finding that you're appreciating and getting value out of the couple hours of content that you get to enjoy and the many hours of work that go into producing it for you, please do consider sending me a tip, either one time through donation at PayPal or Ko-Fi, or by becoming a monthly Patreon subscriber. My ability to do this work in a way that is sustainable to the various expectations, demands, and requirements of being alive in a money-driven society is entirely dependent on your support. So thank you very much in advance for doing so. That's all for the intro. Here is my interview with Rachel Harris on Adventures to the Mind, episode 179, The Wisdom of the Psychedelic Underground. Enjoy. Rachel Harris, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you, James. I'm happy to be here with you.
So I wanted to start off by saying your new book, Swimming in the Sacred, not only did I enjoy it, but I found it very refreshing, which is that I have found myself in an odd place right now with everything that's happening with the psychedelic renaissance, which now is more like the industrializing of psychedelics, the mainstreaming of psychedelics, and so on and so forth. And I often
the gold rush, you mean?
Yes, the gold rush, right? And it feels a lot of the time like I'm having a hard time. There's a kind of constraining of the conversation that's happening, and I understand that the constraining of the conversation is necessary for the extent of legitimizing psychedelics as a medicine, mainstreaming it, all these things, and the profitability, which is going to assist in the mainstreaming and all the rest and the institutionalizing. But I often find that I start to feel like I'm choked off from the essence of the thing, simply because those are the conversations that I am most exposed to, other than the conversations I try to have here on the show. And reading your book, it just felt so refreshing because it felt like it didn't exclude all that other stuff, but it felt like it went back into the heart of what this whole work and this whole thing with psychedelic plants sort of means, at least to me. And so it really was like a breath of fresh air reading it. So I really wanted to thank you right off the bat for making this wonderful book.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I feel, in some ways, I felt like I was preserving a historical perspective that these women have that is sort of getting overwhelmed.
So let's start there. Sort of starting with a foundation of what the book is about. Essentially, what is the thesis of this book, and what background? Hold on, I'm kind of getting tripped up between trying to come up intuitively with a question and the question I have written in front of me. Um, I'll just read it. It feels so unintuitive. I think that it. Okay. I think that it makes sense to couch the interview today in the thesis and background of the book. So let's start there. What is the main thesis of this book, and where did the material for this book come from?
Well, the book is based on in-depth interviews that I did with 15 women who have been practicing underground with all the entheogens for at least 20 years. That was my criteria, 20 years experience. But most of them had 30, 40 years experience. So yes, they were elders because they were mostly over 60. There were only a few in their 60s. The eldest is now 90. And most of them are in their 70s. And these women have really dedicated their lives to working with the medicines underground. So you can imagine what they've risked for 30, 40 years. And, the eldest of the elders, I call her, the one who's about 90, she said, even if these medicines became legal, I would continue to work underground because that's where the sacred container is. Now, that's quite a statement and a commitment to a sacred way of working.
So you feature more than just women in this book. I mean, you have these interviews that you've conducted with these women, and then you've sewn that into the larger narrative of the book. But you do quite a cool dive into various sort of like modern research and sort of the history of psychedelics as it's come up in the West. And in that, you do speak of and refer to various men in the field and in the research and in the history, but you really focused on these or you chose to prioritize female or women guides as your interviewees. What inspired that? Why did you choose to focus on that?
I had spent a wonderful afternoon with one of the prominent male guides. And it wasn't intended to be an interview, but he basically told me his whole story. And it was, we had a lovely time talking and sharing, and I really appreciated his level of experience and his training. And he didn't talk about his relationship with the medicines in the same way that the women do. The women are far more connected intuitively to unseen others, is what I call them. Because yes, it is the plant teachers, the spirit of some of the medicines, but also to ancestors and angels. Nobody talked about angels, but spirit guides. They had sources from other dimensions that I have not really heard the men talk about. I've spoken with a couple of the male guides, and it's not the first thing they talk about. And so I thought that the women were sort of better connected in that way. And that's an extension of the Listening to Ayahuasca book, which is really about hearing a plant spirit and taking advice from the spirit of ayahuasca. So these women have this other source of information and intuitive guidance when they're working with someone. This is something the research teams can't talk about, right? It's not part of Western science and our modern cosmology. This is, from another sense of ontology. It's another sense of reality. So that's why I focused on women. Also, let me just say, to be perfectly honest, I've listened to men for 50 years and I've had enough. So there's that,
Of course.
Might be more than 50 years. It started early. And also, these women are doubly silenced. They're silenced because they're women, and they're silenced because they've been working underground. They continue to work underground. They're not going to appear at conferences to give talks. They're not going to talk about their underground illegal practice. They're still doing it.
Yeah, throughout the book, you Actually, a couple things are coming up. One, I'll just make these quick comments. Like one is like they can't talk about. I mean, like it's the researchers in the field, the people on the sort of front public end. They can't. I'm quoting, talk about these elements because, well, that's not.
Well,
I actually, I even recently did a neuropsych examination or a psychological examination, and I had a questionnaire, and the questionnaire, of course, was trying to determine like how in sync am I with consensus reality? Like how likely am I?
you hear voices.
Well, one of them was like, do you hear voices? And they, but one of the questions is, do you believe as though you can communicate with plants? And in my mind, I was like, of course. But then I was like, if I say yes, they're going to think I'm delusional. So I have to say no because I want to be seen as a stable person because I am a stable person, but I have beliefs that are not in alignment with what is generally considered to be, quote, real. And thus, any suggestion of otherwise in this assessment might suggest that I am delusional. Maybe I am delusional. Maybe we're all delusional. We're having
you made a good decision.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, when I was in private practice, clients would say things to me, and I would say, "Don't ever tell that to a psychiatrist."
Right.
We can work with it here, but don't report this to a psychiatrist.
Right. And the other thing you are mentioning, it was around how the women guides quickly spoke to relationship, and I thought about. It's actually a distinction that I got listening to someone whose work you referenced in your chapter on dying, Stephen Jenkinson, and him talking about this this phrase that mostly gets used in anthropology now, which is the term of like cultural patrimony, which is when they find like the clay pots and the so forth, like the sort of physical or material items that sustained these older cultures. They call it the cultural patrimony, and that the cultural matrimony, although not really used, is less about the physical items that sustain the culture so much as the non-physical items that sustain the sort of the home, the family, the relationships, right? And the idea of being tied into holy matrimony, not so popular these days as a term, is sort of like being like like bound to each other in service to the relationship, to the home, to the family, and so forth. And so I thought about that. I'm making some pretty significant logical jumps here around like the fact that women would be more likely to focus on the relational end of this thing, and men may be more so on my assumption is like
the accoutrements.
Yes, seems like it lines up with this sort of old anthropological concepts. And the last thing I want to mention is you speak multiple times in the book, like you said, these women are doubly silenced. You actually bring up multiple stories of women who played significant roles in what we see as like the foundations of the emergence of psychedelics or psychedelic thinking into Western culture, who are totally erased. One of which I had no idea that Jung, for example, in his journey that became the Red Book, had a female guide. Never heard of her in my life. No one ever brought it up. I haven't.
This is Toni Wolff.
Yeah.
And she was, there's no sort of polite way to say this. She was the second wife, basically. And she was the container for his whole journey into his unconscious and into other realms. And Jung's family erased her from his memoir, what is dreams, memories, and something, his own story of his life. They edited her out of it. As you can imagine, she was the other woman. They weren't all that fond of her, but she was highly intuitive, and she accompanied him along the way.
Yeah, so I find it also too, I know there's a lot of talk right now, like let's feature more female voices and so on and so forth. And this is really important. And I also really appreciated that in your presentation of featuring female voices in the now, you also went back and sort of like, I felt like helped open up and uncover for me just how many roles there were that I just because I've been listening to men talk about it since most of the time that I've been involved in this kind of work, that those stories were lost on me. And so I really appreciated that
Right.
aspect of the
Let me
book as well.
mention another one, Gordon Wasson, who did the Life magazine article in the mid-50s about Maria Sabina and the what she called her little saints, the magic mushroom. She was a curandera in Mexico. He was a banker. His wife was a mycologist.
Valentina,
He doesn't get mentioned. So there are examples of this throughout history and in all the different disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, someone who was also featured in your book, who is now departed, Anne Shulgin as well. I think she gets a little bit more credit maybe than some of these other women, but also like very important woman in the field or in the history of what we have now as a psychedelic field.
Absolutely, yes. And she died a little over a year ago, and she worked. She always said she stopped working with MDMA when it became illegal in the mid-'80s. But the truth is she continued to work underground. And she was very therapeutically inclined. So she had more interaction with people than some of the other guides. The guides all trained with different people. They were all slightly different. There was no one right way. So she always called herself a lay therapist, but she's a naturally therapeutic person. So, and not all the guides are, let me add. They're not therapists by training. One or two have a license, but most of them aren't. And they're not inclined particularly in that direction. They're kind of, well, let's see what you do with this. Let's see. After the journey, we'll do some debriefing. But if you need ongoing counseling, I'll refer you out. But what I'm looking for, if I'm speaking for one of the women, they're looking for a change in your life, in what you bring back to the community and do differently in your own life, and what contribution you're called to make. So they have a whole different perspective than just reducing symptoms, which is very valuable, and it's what the research teams are looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, multiple times throughout the book, you set the stage for this early on, and then you do well to like set the stage for things early on, and then like come back to them. I think you use the term circumambulate in the book, but like circumambulate these essential concepts throughout the book each time, sort of giving it a greater clarity and depth because it's now being increasingly recontextualized. But one of which is that this is not therapy. Like they're not doing therapy. Can you maybe expand a little bit more on that, around this idea of like this work is not therapy?
Well, so we don't really have a role for these women. So they're not therapists. They're not medical people. What are they? Well, they're priestesses. So this is, and not quite, that's not the same as a religious minister. They're high priestesses, I guess is the way to say it. And so they're looking for transformation. They're not working on the details of your childhood history. They're looking for how you can transform your attachment to that childhood history. So, I have one example of a friend of mine who happens to be a Jungian analyst. So he's had tons of his own therapy. He's had his own Jungian analysis because that's part of the training. And then he's working with shaman from Peru. And he said during a ceremony, an old, a history of abuse from his family from childhood came up, and it literally disappeared. Now, he had worked on that in many different therapeutic situations. And so it was what would be called resolved from a therapeutic point of view, but it hadn't disappeared. And in the ceremony, he said it lifted completely out of his energetic system, out of his body. That's a transformation. That's different than a therapeutic resolution. And that's what the women are looking for.
Throughout the course of the book, I kind of kept getting this sense like these women have this other something in perception, and something that I felt attracted to, and something that I felt allured by, and almost like maybe not the best term, but this sort of like magical connection with something, like you said, the unseen world and unseen others. And you even mentioned a number of anecdotes of how this kind of perception or perceptual capacities were even reflective or present in them all the way back into childhood. And you use a number of examples of different people who end up being sort of like tuned in to these unseen worlds, who also had these incredible experiences as children. And it left me with a wondering about whether or not you feel either these women or other people who are doing this sort of the deep guiding psychedelic swimming in the sacred work, if they have a kind of like extrasensory capacity that the rest of us don't have, that they were born into, or if it's a kind of, and they upskill over time, or if this is a kind of capacity that we all could potentially have, but for one reason or another, it's sort of like squashed out or undeveloped.
Well, the women did have unusual childhood spiritual experiences. Many people do, and the children don't talk about it because parents say, "Oh, forget about that," or if they're old enough, they're afraid that someone will think they're crazy. So the culture doesn't support these experiences. And I think these women are gifted. I think that's what you're referring to. I think there really is a gift that they are more attuned and more intuitive, and that they slide between altered states of consciousness more easily than most people. So, one way it came out is they would be telling me about their lives and how they got into this work and how it unfolded, but they weren't chronological. So I'm taking notes because I never wanted to record them because it's so private and underground. So I'm taking notes, and because they're not reporting chronologically, I'm lost. Did this happen before that? And they just don't, they're not tied to that linear time frame the way I am. They're kind of more vague, more fluid. And so I think they really do have a gift. And, when researchers study psychotherapy, it often comes down to who the therapist is, whether they're particularly gifted or not. It's way more important than whatever technique they're using. And so, let's face it, we all have different gifts. Not all of us can be stars in the NBA. We can't all be professional basketball players. So we're all gifted in different ways. And I think the women are gifted. There was, the book I recommend for people interested in guiding is The Secret Chief Revised. And Maps has this online, so you don't even have to buy it. The PDF is online. And it's about Leo Zeff, and he was described as having an unusual greatness of heart. And so there it is. Now, he had a full career as a therapist. He was Jungian oriented. And then he retired around 70 and then had his own experiences with the entheogens. This was in the early 60s. And he came out of retirement to work with people using psychedelics. So that description of he had an unusual greatness of heart, I think points toward his gift, that this was a gifted therapist to begin with. And he's actually the person who trained the eldest of the elders. He's one of her teachers. So, there is a historical lineage here.
So I have there are three kind of questions, and I'm not sure which one comes in at what time in order for it not to like muddy the arc, but I'm just gonna give it a try.
Just thinking I could say just something else about
go for
this
it.
Sort of intuitive and it's very it's very embodied. So the women would often say, well, I felt it in my bones. And I called it, I think, a psychedelic way of knowing, that they knew inside themselves intuitively, or they received help from an unseen other. So there was because of their connection to these other dimensions, there was a real certainty in their intuition. But from a psychological point of view, because, I still have that going on, I haven't escaped that. There is a measurement of the psychological variable of absorption. And this was a scale that was developed to measure hypnotizability. And these women would score very high on absorption. And one of the questions is, when you go to a movie theater, do you sort of enter into the movie and forget you're sitting in a theater? It's that, do you sort of disappear into the film? And I think this speaks to the women's fluidity, moving from one state of consciousness to another and blending them, that they're very flexible in that kind of way.
Yeah, this discussion about I think thin veils and absorption, and your whole commentary there around how some people could end up being accidentally overdosed on psychedelics because they're so sensitive.
Theory.
Yeah,
we haven't tested this yet, but I think people who score high on this measure probably need less medicine. And we're not even talking about this yet. This is just my clinical observation.
Yeah, so that's interesting to me, because I'm just thinking about, there's a lot of things happening that I hadn't prepared to talk about. So here we go. It's like we're off the cuff now. Is a couple of things. One, the kind of there's different pockets where the psychedelic conversation and the sort of primary memes, pardon the term, in the conversations they're different. And there's sort of the underground psychonautic online, like people taking psychedelics and talking about it kind of domain. And one of the things that I've seen is quite problematic and emerging out of that is this sort of, it's not Terence's fault, but based in Terence's language, Terence McKenna, this whole like heroic dose, 5 dried grams, like go big or go home, like ego death, this kind of like, I don't know, almost like competitive ego deathing or something. And
that's a new phrase.
It's coined
I've called it the cowboy approach.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It's very American. I guess, is Canada like that too?
A little bit. Yeah. I definitely, anyways, that's aside.
Yeah,
I think it's a Western thing. I even just recently saw a post on a subreddit I follow. I think it's like R Shrooms, and the heading was like, "I'm concerned about y'all," and like outlining of like how concerned they are, like watching people, like you have people talking about like posting like, "I'm about to do 7 grams and blah blah blah," and then people posting like a few weeks later being like, "I feel like I want to die," and like all these intense things. And this sort of prioritization towards like big doses that end up getting people hurt. And as a consequence, a sort of growing recorrection, which is like, stop shaming people for taking lower doses. Now, this kind of comes back to the idea that psychedelics can change fundamental personality traits. And we have some evidence about trait openness from the Big Five. I think there's some stuff there about psilocybin and conscientiousness, but I don't know for sure. But thinking about trait absorption, I know for myself over time, I've noticed that I need lower and lower doses to get deeper and deeper into the experience.
You know how to get there.
Can you talk about that?
You know the terrain, yeah. And that's what, these women had a lot of, they worked on themselves using the medicines. And they had a lot of experience with all the medicines, all levels of doses. So they really know the terrain and they know their inner worlds. And so it's easy for them to follow where someone else is going. And of course, the current psychedelic therapists, it's difficult to get that much experience. It not only is it illegal, but it takes time. You don't just do it in a month or two, and you don't do it as part of an online training course. So these women really had years of working on themselves. Part of what I've picked up in talking to people, some things that I'm concerned about is, one, I'm hearing not just high doses, but people tripping alone, at home alone. And that's worrisome. I mean, that's never been recommended. And I just lost what and the other thing is, some therapists are saying, well, I need a small dose of the medicine in order to be able to follow you, to join you on your journey. And I'm like, no, you don't. You need to be more experienced. And the more experienced you are, the more fluid you become in being able to shift states of consciousness and follow the person. If the therapist needs to take a small dose to be with the person on their journey, then they're not experienced enough. And I would not go with them.
This brings up a very important question. I would say this is a very important question, and another one of those sort of like central things or topics of discussion as this sort of psychedelic emergence continues. And that is whether or not psychedelic therapists should have had their own experiences with the psychedelics they're providing. And there's obviously two camps on this, one of which is, yes, they should. And the other camp is, no, they shouldn't, because I've heard arguments like, well, you wouldn't be concerned about a psychiatrist prescribing, Zoloft, if they've never had Zoloft in their life, or, would you not go see a male gynecologist because they don't have a womb, or like these kinds of like comparisons that it's like, no, if you've got therapy experience, then that's actually greater than psychedelic experience when it comes to providing psychedelic therapy. So you don't need psychedelics. You don't need to have that experience. And the other camp being like, if you've never had a psychedelic experience, you have no idea what it's actually like. And you really can't support a person while they're in their experience. Not really. What's your take on this?
I'm trying to find a professional way to say this. I think if you want to be a psychedelic therapist, you should take as much drugs as possible. I have obviously failed at finding a professional way to say this. And legitimately, it takes time and effort to figure out how to do that. But you get a whole different perspective, and it's a false comparison to compare it to a psychiatrist who's prescribing Zoloft. It's not the same. That tweaks our system, but it doesn't take us into other realms. Now, one thing that's interesting is, these women elders, the high priestesses, I'm calling them, they don't do therapy. So they're sitting. Now, that's a specific role. Now we have psychedelic therapists who do both roles. They do therapy and they do the sitting. Those are two separate functions with two different skill sets and gifts. Someone can be a wonderful therapist and not be very good at sitting there for 6-7 hours. So, and maybe some people can do both, but we have to understand that these are two separate roles. But I'm a very strong believer in anybody working in this field, either sitting with someone journeying or doing psychedelic therapy before or after. They need to really know the terrain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't done a survey, so this is just a hot take without a lot of data. But my sense is that the people who are saying that you don't need to take psychedelics or have had a psychedelic experience to provide psychedelic therapy haven't experienced psychedelics.
So they don't know what you're talking about, is what you're saying. Which
essentially, yes.
There it is. That's the problem.
Yeah. Or they've had one or two experiences and they think that qualifies them to have a real sense of what it's all about. Or they've read a bunch of other people's experiences and they think that gives them a good sense of what it's all about. Or they're recognizing that realistically, either from an ethical standpoint of like telling someone they have to take psychedelics if they're going to provide psychedelic therapy, or from a cost and like the numbers game of like, realistically, we're not going to be able to boom out all the therapists that need to get out as soon as they can get out in order for all these companies that are putting in all this money to actually make a profit, and expect that each of those therapists are properly and fully experienced on psychedelics as a journey they've been on or are, have been on many times, that they've been guided and they've been deep. If we have that expectation, we're just not going to be able to get the horde of therapists out there that we need.
I don't know how to solve that problem. That's a realistic issue. But I do know a handful of good, solid therapists who are working on themselves very diligently with one or another of the medicines. And so they are seeking out that experience. It is possible. And of course, because there's such a need for people trained in this realm, they're also working with people with integration. So they're doing both at the same time because the need is so great. So I have to say, yes, I understand that, but make an effort. Make an effort to take the drugs to get the experience. Yeah. And um I told one of the elders, I said, you do know that just licensed therapists don't necessarily need to have had their own therapy. And she didn't know that. She couldn't believe it. How can you be a therapist and not have had your own therapy? Well, it's not always required. And so people don't always do it. And she just was horrified at the thought of that. I mean, one of the axioms is know the medicine. You do not serve a medicine you do not know. And so this is, you really need to know the territory. And when we look at countertransference, this is why analysts have their own analysis, so they know how to work with their own countertransference. And so the same thing would come up with people sitting. I never have done any underground work. And I know my countertransference would involve a lot of my own inner fear. It's like, oh my God, what's happening now? Well, that's not very helpful. That's not a good intervention if you're sitting, but that would be my own countertransference. This is why I'm not gifted. And I don't meet the qualifications that these elders meet. This is not my work in the world. And so I think you have to have your own experience to know where you get scared, where you're worried, where you lose track of things. You have to know within yourself where your person is traveling.
Yeah, and in that, like one of the comments I've made in another, I think it was with Frank Anderson, when I was asking him his thoughts on this, and he was like, "No, you don't need to take psychedelics before providing psychedelic therapy." I'd said, like, until you're in the experience and you know what a massive impact the difference between a neutral face and the most subtle of smiles can have on your entire experience, and you know that viscerally, then as a therapist, you have really no idea how impactful just your basic presence is having on this other person. And you speak to this in the book in a different way when you talk about these guides speaking to how they can create space in their client, lack of a better term, their client's journey by using breath to create space in themselves. And like speaking to a kind of relationship that's possible when people are in these deep altered states that is not so easy to describe if A, you've never experienced it, or B, you're living in a paradigm which is either like it's just proper psychology or it's biological psychiatry or it's so on and so forth, but it doesn't allow for this sort of like the subtlety of this kind of relationship that's possible.
Right. And it's very nuanced and it's very somatic. So you use the term viscerally, and you gave the example of the underground elder speaking about how she takes a deep breath herself to make space within the body of the client. And, I asked her, I came back to her. I always called people back and this is someone I've seen many times, the elder. And I said, well, what do you really mean by that? And she said, well, what don't you understand? And then, of course, we both just laughed. I mean, because the only way to really understand it is if you've been there, if you have that visceral understanding yourself, and you know how under the influence, people merge. There's a merging so that it's not two individuals there. There's a system in the room.
I thought about, I posted this on Twitter recently and I got a little bit of pushback, and fair enough. I expect pushback anytime I make a statement, and I'm a public figure, and that's okay. And the statement I made was like, how much would you trust the knowledge and experience of a sex therapist who's never had a sexual experience?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. Now I got some pushback. It's like, they're not comparable. I was like, well, I don't know. I think it was Stan Groff who put these all in sort of the similar category, which is like birth, death, sex, psychedelics. They're all sort of intense
Altered
experiences
state.
of meaning, right? Of altered states. And to me, that's how I think about it. It's like, certainly
That's
I
a
could.
better comparison than Zoloft.
Yes.
It's a better one.
Yeah.
And you get pushback. Well, you get pushback on anything, I guess.
Of course. And also, again, there's a lot of complexity in the discussion, and there's a lot of opinions on this as well. So I'm being nice. So my next question is related here. And I think several of the things we've already danced around, which is, given these interviews, given this sort of like, I don't know, this contact you were able to make with this other world of work, and also knowing that you're sharp and attending to also what's happening on the above ground institutionalizing end of things, what do you feel is, to you now, or maybe it was previous beforehand, but what do you feel is almost glaringly absent, or maybe subtly absent, from what we're doing here on the Western end in preparing people to provide psychedelic therapy, that is maybe essential or foundational with these elder guides?
Well, I think the research teams could have consulted with the women. They could have connected. The women would have talked to them. They just never, and they could have easily figured out who they were. They could have located, maybe not all of them, but certainly a few of them. And they didn't do that. And they could have really had them in as consultants, giving advice about what questions to ask and what's significant and what isn't. I can give a concrete example of this from Hopkins. Is they did an internet survey on, did you encounter an entity? And so they divided the responses. They had thousands of responses. They divided them by what medicine, what drug you were on when you encountered an entity. Well, I had consulted with one of the elders before I did my research study that was published in 2012. And I asked her, what question should I ask in my questionnaire on ayahuasca use in North America? And she said, ask them if they have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca, and how do they communicate? So I asked that, and I found out that 3/4 of the 81 subjects had an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. So Hopkins does this big study, and they did not ask about an ongoing relationship because they themselves are not sensitive to that. And so all they found out was yes or no, I had an encounter with an entity. So they missed, I have an ongoing relationship. I turn to the spirit of ayahuasca when I need help. I receive guidance. I mean, it's this ongoing relationship and process. And the team missed that. And so that's a concrete example. Had they consulted with really pretty much any of the elders, they would have done that study differently. And the study resulted in 2 published papers, but they missed the real question. So, and that's, that's the nature of it. Roland Griffiths, as you know, has terminal, I think, colon cancer.
Yeah.
And so now he's talking about his own psychedelic experience, which before he would never even do. So here you have a leading researcher who had no experience with psychedelics because he wanted to remain objective. So finally, now he has experience. He talks about this in an interview. He had an LSD trip, and he was given the advice to be more transparent about his own process of facing his mortality. And so that's why he's now all of a sudden, finally, after 25 years doing research, talking about receiving advice while under the influence and following the advice. So this is not the same as an ongoing relationship, but it's much more than just asking, yes, no, did you have an encounter? And it's very helpful that he has become much more transparent. But this was missed for a few decades.
Is there anything else that you see is missing from the sort of like the present preparing of therapists to provide psychedelic therapy in the Western world?
Well, because we're trying to churn them out so quickly in large numbers, and partly because of COVID, and just it's more efficient to have online courses. What we're losing is the emphasis on working on yourself, getting your own experience, and then an apprenticeship. Our culture doesn't really value apprenticeships. We sort of have lost respect for spending years learning a trade. And I think, I say my whole career is based on 2 apprenticeships I had with 2 different women. One was a Rolfer, was sort of number 2 to Ida Rolf, and the other one was a researcher. So you couldn't find 2 more different women. But I was at the elbow with each of them at a different time in my life for pretty much a decade each. And I couldn't do the work I'm doing now without their influence, the gift of time and energy and focus that they gave me. I mean, I used to say in the research office, my desk was 20 feet from the director of research, and not one sentence left that office that she didn't look at. So it was, an apprenticeship involves pretty much constant care, not just supervision, but care and ongoing teaching and a gradual movement toward independence. And I had that in both those realms. And how can we talk about that with an online course that goes for even a year? It's just not part of it. But if someone wants to become really skilled, they need to get more of their own experience and find someone to work with closely.
Yeah, it goes back to this question about whether or not psychedelic therapists need to have taken the medicine, or pardon the terminology.
And I kind of worry about this, that these women are sort of a dying breed. They're kind of a moment, sort of like a ring in a tree. They're a moment in history kind of, and, we're not going to have these people again, but we will have a small group of very experienced therapists who have taken the time to work on themselves, and the time and energy and the courage that takes. So this will continue. It will just be a small category. And the way I console myself, because I worry about these things, is, if you decide you need therapy, there's the whole array of different licensed therapists you can go to, some of whom, have done depth work on themselves, and some of whom have done, nothing, basically, except graduate. So there's a whole, it's a buyer beware market. So it's the same thing with psychedelics.
It makes me think a previous housemate of mine and myself had an ongoing conversation for a little while, just exploring the difference between being certified and being qualified, and that we in our modern world tend to confuse or conflate these two as being the same, or that certification equals qualification, and a lack of certification indicates a lack of qualification, but that these are actually two almost mutually exclusive things that happen to correspond sometimes.
Right. So I say, I used to get phone calls. I'm retired now, but I was in private practice for about 40 years. And people would call me up and say, do you use this technique? What's your approach? And I would say, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking, have you had therapy? Was it successful? How long was it? How many times have you had therapy? Those are the questions to ask. And it's the same thing if I'm looking for someone to guide me on a journey, I have a right to ask them, how much of this work have you done? How much have you done yourself? Did you study with anyone? Do you have someone you can call if you need to? We can ask these questions. And if someone doesn't want to answer those questions, forget it. And the other thing I tell people is, if someone is not taking a detailed, comprehensive medical interview of you, don't go to them. Because the underground women, they do long interviews in preparation about medical and psychiatric history, and they have doctors who they work with, they can call on when they have questions. If someone's doing this work alone with no colleagues, I wouldn't trust them.
So this next question, I feel like we're already touching on it, but just to get into it very explicitly, is assuming it's even possible, if it becomes the case that psychedelics sort of predominantly exist in the Western world as a psychiatric medication provided in psychotherapeutic contexts, what do you feel is going to be lost?
Well, the underground will continue. We know that. So it won't be lost completely. But the wisdom that these women have is at risk for being lost. And here's an example, because their vision is much bigger than the medical version or even the psychotherapeutic version of reducing symptoms. Here's what the eldest of the elders says. And I have to say, I'm a different person because I interviewed these women. They had a really big, powerful effect on me. No medicines involved in that sense. But here's the eldest saying, "We are responsible for our intentions and our choices, responsible to ourselves and to humanity." So you get a sense of the vision of what they hope for working with people, that it's way beyond symptom reduction. And I'm not putting symptom reduction down, because the subjects that the studies are working with, those people have been treatment resistant and they have suffered often for decades. But there's another way of working with the medicines throughout the whole lifespan that is much bigger. And I don't want that way to be lost. And so with the women underground, maybe someone will come into them maybe twice a year, once a year. Maybe they bring their partner. Maybe they come in with 3 generations. I've sat in ayahuasca ceremonies with 3 generations in a family. Wow. And it's very sacred. It's wonderful. And you have a sense that family is working on themselves in a really big way. I was very humbled just to be in the same ceremony. And so the women working underground have a much bigger vision for what these medicines can do. And I don't want to lose that.
So I'm going to ask it's almost an opposite question, but it's complementary, which is that, one of the propositions being made is that by moving this work above ground, we're going to make it safer for people, because then we'll have institutional oversight. We'll have, legislation that sort of commits people to certain, areas of conduct that is, makes their licensing sort of vulnerable, or has their licensing dependent on upholding these kinds of conduct agreements and so forth. What do you feel is if there's any, but what inherent complications or risks are present simply by having this work be underground? And I'm thinking specifically, there's a number of things that have come up over the last couple of years. It's been the big emergence of look at how much abuse is happening in the underground. Explicit abuse, but then also much more insidious, subtle forms of manipulation. Do you feel like that's an inherent complication of this work existing underground?
Also with licensed practitioners.
Yes.
So yes, this is part of human nature, evidently, I'm sorry to say. There was research done, I think, in the 70s and 80s, where the American Psychological Association did a survey, and it was an anonymous survey, so people reported, and 10% of male therapists had had sex with a client.
Wow.
That was the self-report. So how many actually did but didn't report it, we don't know. But that was the self-report. Women, it was more women therapists, it was down around 2%. And that could now be different. That could have changed. So this is a real risk with psychedelics because the boundaries are loosened. And you have to be careful whether you're working underground or in a medical institution. So this is something that we are going to have to deal with as a profession. And the problem with working with underground practitioners who don't have a license is there's no consequence. I mean, you can report them for working underground, but that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, nobody really wants to do that. But even in the Me Too cases, it's very hard to prove that sexual abuse was not consensual. These are tough cases to go through. So at least if someone's licensed, they are at risk for losing their license for at least a significant period of time. So this is something that we're going to have to deal with more and more. And yes, cases have already emerged. And the way, what I've heard is the indigenous women, what they say in South America is, I'm never alone with a shaman. I always bring a relative. So they know there's a risk, and they bring a female relative usually. So I've heard that as a way of dealing with it. That's not always possible with an underground journey. So I'm afraid this is something we're just going to have to work with. And the theory is that the more the therapist, the practitioner has worked on themselves, the more clear they'll be about their own needs and their own issues, and they'll be less likely to transgress. That's the hope. We'll see.
Yeah, I sort of intentionally left out this also happens with licensed therapists too. Hoping that you would speak to it, so I appreciate that you did.
Yeah.
And your comment about there being there isn't any immediate and apparent consequences for those working in underground was like a very cool sort of point of difference. And I think another point of difference, and I've been taking the iSeers course for ayahuasca facilitation. I don't facilitate, but I am a commentator and a person paying attention. So if they have a whole course on what sort of things are happening that are problematic and what structures could be implemented to prevent these problematic things from happening in non-traditional ayahuasca contexts, well, this is good information. I'd like to be learned on these topics. And one of the things that came up was, with respect to being in the underground, is that he talks about I actually interviewed him as well on this, the 6 pitfalls for ayahuasca facilitators that they tend to fall into. There's sex, money, power, isolation, legal issues, and intercultural relationships. And
that's a good list.
Right. The comment that he brought up was this, that there's a kind of thing that happens when an underground provider, because of the very nature of underground facilitation, is that the more skilled they get, the sort of more idealized they become in community. And as a consequence, the more isolated they become, because they get sort of put up on a pedestal, but also because they increasingly have less colleagues who are on the same skilled level, or there becomes like a hierarchy of supporting the work, or they become so skilled that the work becomes their only thing, so they don't actually get to meet people and interact as just like one-to-one. So the only place they're meeting new people, and realistically, like if you're single, you want to meet people, right? Like, are going to be in the context of the work. And that that the very structure of keeping things clandestine like this and the necessity to do so because of its illegality creates a sort of like breeding ground for these pitfalls to become increasingly harder to not fall into the longer you're in the work and the more isolated you become. I guess a proposition would be on the above ground, that's less likely to happen because you'll have supervisors and because you'll have colleagues and because you'll be like having regular reviews and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
There are a couple of approaches to this, and we can put them. I can send you the websites for them. There's a website for ethics for spiritual teachers that has it's a totally nonprofit organization, and it's very good, and it has a list of an ethical code. And then there's a group, and this is a more selective group of the acknowledged Buddhist teachers who have been meeting and formed an organization basically to increase the collegial supervision and to reduce any harm from long-term retreats and that sort of thing. So so there's some movement within the psychedelic community to create these kinds of organizations. They're having trouble getting themselves started. This is a very young field, and so these other organizations are well established. This is going to be an ongoing problem, and the isolation is a real issue. And my statement is inflation is alive and well in the psychedelic community,
like ego inflation.
Yeah, and the medicines, of course, tend toward that, and people fall into projecting, spiritual evolution onto the person doing the work. It's not always true. I never said about these women elders that they're spiritually evolved in any way. I don't make that judgment at all. They're just practiced. They have lots of experience in their practice and they have a lot of wisdom to teach, but that doesn't mean they're spiritually evolved. It's not the same thing. And we're going to have problems, and we already do. So I actually like that list a lot from my seers.
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with some of that information in an email thread afterwards.
That's right, and I'd love to see it, and I can send you these organizations.
Yes, please. In fact, I'll also put links to these things in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. Because this is a recording. This is for others.
Good.
There was something that you had said there. Is it going to come back? I think in your book too, you talked about I think therapists. I don't think you use this term, but I've heard the term like therapist heal thyself or something to this effect. And you talk about the importance of cleaning up, cleaning up your past. And this is something that also, you talked about the countertransference with, inexperienced psychedelic providers. And I just think about that too, which is like, if we're not, and this is maybe a general statement about psychedelics as well. There's a lot of waking up that can happen, like levels and levels of waking up that can happen, but waking up doesn't amount to cleaning up. And this is a Douglas Tataran reference. We have to, we wake up, but then we also have to clean up and then we have to grow up, and these things aren't necessarily going to happen by default because the other is happening in some measure. And I think that sort of cleaning up and growing up is an essential part of being, I think, a good person in the world, or an effective person at being a good person in the world, but also especially an effective somebody helping somebody else through deep challenge or profound altered states.
Yes. Was that a quote from somebody? Waking up, cleaning up, growing up?
Yeah. So colleague and friend, Douglas Tataran, he has something called the bioemotive framework, and another practice called Nadera, which is sort of like a structured crying process to help alleviate emotional charge in the body, and also sort of works to access deep sort of like reserves of where these feelings are coming from, yada, yada, yada. But he has this proposition of, I think he calls it the 4 facets of transformation, somewhat based on Ken Wilber's work, but with a little alteration. And he talks about waking up, cleaning up. So waking up being like, oh, recognizing, like I am not my thoughts would be a kind of waking up, or like I am a person of consequence. That would be a kind of waking up. And cleaning up is going in and like helping to no longer be unconsciously directed by wounds from the past in the present. You talk about in your book that never goes away. You don't erase it, but you can become increasingly less subject to the knee-jerk scripts left over from those wounds. And then growing up is this sort of like almost like grinding up against reality, where as we like bring into things, like we try to do things in life and we have certain ideas about it, and we have certain thoughts about how it's going to go and who this person is and who we are. And then we kind of meet life and life's like, yeah, no, sorry. That's not how that works. And like learning from that and adjusting accordingly over time is a kind of growing up process. And his last one is called looking around, which I guess is different than showing up. But anyways, looking around, and that's the development of different perceptual capacities that enable us to navigate reality differently. For example, the women that you were speaking about, these guides, the looking around aspect of their development would have been like developing this sort of perceptual skill set for, thin veils. You're saying like shifting between altered states, sort of being able to, non-conceptually sense and know where a person is in their journey and how to breathe and move and through their own sort of like breath and spaciousness in order to create space in their client that allows that client to be more easefully or gracefully moving through whatever they're in. That was sort of a long, answer. I'm sorry. But that's where it comes from.
Like the cleaning up, growing up, that says a lot. And I think, the women are looking for another level than looking around, or at least I am when I'm working, when I did have a practice. And that was that I would say, we were ready to terminate when life becomes the therapist, when what you're doing in your life is supporting you and challenging you, and you're growing and you're working with your life in a way that's bigger. And at that point, life becomes the big therapist. And I think that's in alignment with what I'd read before about responsible to ourselves and to humanity. But Gary Snyder, the poet, the environmentalist poet, has another way of saying it. And this points to the same thing. Ultimately, all such journeys are done for the sake of the whole, not as some private quest. That there's the sense of who I am, and the cleaning up, and now I've lost it. Growing up. Now, what do I give to the whole community? So there's some sense of working with life in a bigger way. And James Hillman refers to this with his acorn theory, is that we have an inner destiny to live up to that is unique to each of us. And how do we rise to that occasion? And that's what I think the elders are looking for in their work with the medicines in a much bigger way and throughout a lifespan.
Let's shift content a little bit.
Okay, where are we going?
Okay, I want to go a little bit more into we've been talking a lot about facilitation end of things, like what these guides are doing, and then the sort of the pipeline of bringing therapists into the world. That's sort of like that end of things. I want to focus now a little bit on the sort of navigation and integration part of this, that, what you learned out of your like experience with the research that you've done. And then also in speaking with these guides, there were some interesting things that had come up in your book that refer to the navigation and integration of experiences as the person receiving it. And one of which was, you spoke about the sort of, how did I word this here? A sort of growing attention and prioritization on the mystical experience as the experiential high mark of a good psychedelic session. Now, previously, what you talked about the psychedelic cowboy and the competitive ego deathing, that aside, that's kind of a different
That's
issue.
a great phrase, by the way.
Thank you. I'll try to put it into Urban Dictionary. Anyone listening, if you put that into Urban Dictionary, please quote me. Yeah. So, but you also speak about this sort of like, this in the research, this prioritization and attention to the mystical experience as being an experiential high mark of a good psychedelic session. But in your book, you suggest, well, hold on, that's not necessarily true. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And this is, I'm glad we're looping back on this about the overvalue we've put on large doses and that the mystical experience is the critical therapeutic factor. In Europe, they've been using psychedelics, and they use them in a psycholytic way, not psychedelic. So they use them at lower doses and embedded in a therapeutic relationship. So maybe they do a journey once a month within a therapy context of 1 or 2 years. So you get a sense of many more journeys, but weekly therapy, at least weekly therapy, maybe even twice a week, but you have a sense of working over time and a more gradual open up and working through. And this is the opposite of 1 night of ayahuasca is worth 10 years of therapy. It's that, wait a minute, we have some work to do, and the entheogens can help us open things up, and those things that come up have to be worked through. So I think it was in the ayahuasca book. I'm not sure where I wrote about this, but it was a 40-ish, what I now call a young guy, who had been, from that school of 1 night of ayahuasca is worth 10 years. And then he said he finally, as you say, kind of woke up and realized all of his relationships were crashing and burning. And so he decided to go into therapy. And he said, this is a revelation. It does something completely different. And the ceremonial experiences from working with ayahuasca can feed into therapy, but they don't necessarily always clean it up completely. And so there's work to do in a therapeutic context. So I can send you a recent article that just came out about the psycholytic approach that's used in Europe. And I think in the title, it talks about it as a neglected approach. Now, I have to say, this would cost a lot of money. This is not cost effective. 2 years of therapy is a significant investment, but it is another way of using the medicines in a therapeutic approach. And I hope, again, that this is not lost and becomes one of the items on the on the smorgasbord of using psychedelics. I think this is one legitimate approach.
Yeah, it makes me think of like an experience I had recently chatting with a friend of mine. They had been doing lower doses of psilocybin. Well, should I share this story? No, I won't. I don't think it's fair. I don't know for sure. No one would ever know who I was talking about, but I don't know if it's fair. So, okay.
And I want to clarify, psycholytic doses are not microdoses. Microdoses are subperceptual. You don't feel them. A lower dose is still a journey. It's just not a mind-blowing, ego-deathing competition.
Yeah. I'll speak about my own experiences and my own work is one of the things that I put in my book, Decomposing the Shadow, was like, thinking like, yeah, realistically, a good dose for this kind of work is somewhere between like 3 and 4 grams. Cause it's like, has to be like the work that I was talking about is like greater than like you're fully in the experience, but not so far in the experience that you're like launched well beyond realities that are, relevant and seemingly related to your baseline. Right. And I've seen when I've helped other people through with integration work, it's usually the experiences where they're like, oh yeah, I got to have more or go big or try to get that mystical experience. That's where the healing is, that they end up getting quite hurt. And that generally the consequences of a lower dose session that doesn't go so well is usually less dramatic than a higher dose session that doesn't go so well. Yeah.
Let's be real. Yeah. Yeah, a number of the old timers, not the women elders, but people who have been in this community for 40, 50 years, everybody knows someone who was damaged seriously and that it derailed their life in some way. So it's very serious. Damage happens. And there's a risk if you don't consider your medical and psychiatric history, and there's a risk if you push too far.
I also noticed that when I said 3.5 to 4 grams, your eyes widened. Did you feel like that I was suggesting something higher than you thought would be a good space to do this kind of work?
Yeah, that's on the high. I would still say that's on the high end. I mean, I know people are doing these so-called heroic, maybe we should call them stupid dosages, but instead of heroic, as if it's a good thing. But yeah, that's still a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. It's interesting because looking back now where I'm at, and I find that I get a lot of value in two and so, where 10 years ago it was 3.5, 4. Otherwise I felt like I was just way too much stuck running the numbers in my head.
Yeah.
Anyways,
we don't have a science of dosing. I mean, I know more is not better, but we don't really have a science of, well, should you do 2 or 3 grams? And so it's a challenge to get the dose right. When I did an MDMA session with one of the elders, and she gave me too much. And after 5 or 6 hours, I crawled to the bathroom. That's not a typical ecstasy journey. I'm on all fours trying to get to the bathroom. And I went to an ayahuasca space. I write about that because that path was sort of well worn, but I could have done with a good bit less. And she said, well, I thought you're intellectual and we had to knock out your brain. But no, she didn't know about how easily I slip into altered states. And so she didn't think about it in that way. And so, a year or two later, I realized, I've never done a ketamine session. I should at least know what that's like. And so I went to a clinic. So I had a medical doctor and a therapist with me the whole time. And I did a lozenge for the first hour. And then the question was, the medical doctor says to me, do you want to go longer and deeper? And I don't think I answered. I think I just pulled down my pants off my hip, and she gave me an IM shot. And that went longer and deeper. And at the end of it, I said to her, you gave me the perfect dosage of, the intramuscular shot. And she said, I've never given such a small dosage. And wow. I said, how did you know? And she said, I saw your reaction to the lozenge, and I knew you didn't need that much. That's good dosing. That's a good clinician, medical doctor, observant, experienced, made the right decision. And it was like, hallelujah, it was perfect. And so I think, we have to develop more skills and better intuition about even how to choose to dose ourselves. So here's my confession. I microdose with mushrooms because I have an aging brain and it brightens my brain. So I'm very happy with my relationship with mushrooms. And I know someone had given me a chocolate bar with mushrooms to microdose. And so they had this is the dose. You take 1 square of chocolate. I knew not to do that. So I took half a square. I had a full-blown psychedelic journey.
Wow.
Yes, I was supposed to be somewhere and I couldn't make it. There's no way I can get in a car. So now I take, I think, a 1/6 or 1/4 of that chocolate square. So, this is how we learn, and everybody's different, and every medicine is different. And sometimes we're going to have an, oh, wow, and we'll learn from it. But I don't know a better way than just a learning process. But let's at least be explicit that there is a learning process.
Sure. And explicit that in the learning process, it's a pretty safe bet to lean on the side of start low and go slow.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm actually thinking about, speaking of microdosing, the sort of trend of microdosing, and here in Canada, I imagine it's the same in the US. There's like a growing number of not so legal online microdose capsule dispensary somethings, and like seeing that like these capsules have like 250 milligrams of psilocybin in them. I'm like, that's
not a microdose.
That's not a microdose. Like that's enough for me to have to like sit down and not drive a car, but I've also known people that do like microdose coaching and have worked with people who didn't even experience a subtle effect until they're at about 500 milligrams. So there is like a very interesting variation in dose response between people.
Yeah. Yeah. And so sometimes it is just experimental.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, let's get off the dosing conversation back into that was almost like we're having like a preparation talk. I want to get into navigation and integration again. So a very cool concept that you present in the book that I felt really, positively affected me. It was almost like, it's not like you told me something new. It's like you said something in the book that like turned a light on. I was like, oh, that light was always there. I just hadn't had it turned on yet, which was this concept that, of the experiences working on the person. That it's like the insights that arise, they work on you over time. Now, what I find interesting about that is that at first glance, it almost seems like the opposite of what people would generally consider as psychedelic integration, which is you work on those insights, but you're suggesting that the insights can work on you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Isn't that a wonderful phrase? It's really a wonderful phrase. Let me just say that I'm in therapy again for the 100th time. I mean, I've spent my life either doing therapy or being in therapy.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. So I'm with a Jungian analyst. And so I told her this wonderful dream that I'm not going to repeat. But basically, we worked with it a little bit. But basically, she said, you can continue that dream either, sort of programming yourself to continue the dream when you go to sleep at night, or just imagining that you can continue that dream, and that dream will continue to work on you. So it was what the Jungians call a big dream, a significant dream, and it has a power that continues to unfold within me. And then she's looking at, and how does that manifest in your life? What begins to change in your life? So this is an example of an inner event, whether it's from a psychedelic journey or a dream, certainly from the unconscious, continuing to work on me over time. And I'm protecting it by not repeating it here publicly. Yes. Yeah. I'm protecting that dream. It's like a little plant, a little seedling growing and sprouting and having an influence. And so there is this sense of a way of working with your inner life that unfolds over time. And the women one woman in particular talked about this when she had, I think the experience that she had, it was unbelievable to me, but she was on a vision quest on a mountain, sleeping in a sleeping bag, no tent. And I'm like, why are you out there? This is not something I would do. I at least want a tent, although, a tent is not going to really protect you. But anyway, she said to her dawn, she woke up and she felt a presence. and it was a large cat basically standing over her, and the cat swiped her from her hip to her knee, so she had an open wound. And that was the event. This is a real event. This is not a dream. And what she said was that event worked on her and continues to work on her, and it's now decades later. So this is one of these mystical events that happens. How many people report a large cat, she called it a jaguar, being basically, she was attacked, even though it didn't go full force attack. What was the meaning of this? What did this do for her, to her? And she said in the days that followed, she had a conversation with the jaguar. Now that's a way of working, taking something that happened in the outer world into the inner world and continuing to work with it. And how did that conversation go? What did the jaguar have to teach her, to tell her? And then what difference did that make in her life? And then because her calling is working with people, how did that influence her work with people? So you get a sense of how there's this working with energy, with energetic events that happens, and that the work is ongoing. Then she reported 30 years later, she was on another meditative vision quest, and someone gave her an obsidian carving of a jaguar. And she felt, oh, the jaguar is coming back into my life. And she connected it to the original, and then again continued to have a dialogue with the jaguar, the spirit of the jaguar. So you see, she went from a concrete little carving of a jaguar to the spirit of a jaguar. So you get a sense of the level of this work. One of the women, let me get this. This is such a wonderful statement. It took me a long time even to begin to understand this. I can't say I do, but I know it carries the same message. This is from one of the women. You get a mystical experience, but so what? You have to learn how to work with energy. If you don't shift your awareness, you'll never know how energy works. So you get a sense of this. This is a different elder speaking about energy in particular, and that the process goes way beyond one mystical experience. And then you see how this other elder, these two elders don't know each other, but that she's working with the energy of this real life experience, taking it inside her psyche, and then it appears 30 years later in the form of a little carving. And you get a sense of this working with energy and the energetic event working on you. So I hope this speaks to, it's much more than a mystical experience. And the way these medicines can work with you goes into much bigger realms and purposes.
Something that felt like sort of sewn into that is the relevance of the attention and the quality of the attention placed to that event, that insight, that something that's working on the person, and the necessity of giving or providing onto it a kind of attention that allows it to do so. Because it feels very easy for me to conceive of a different sort of like narrative world space, a worlding, to reference a part of your book, that would write such an experience off.
Yes.
And how an experience like this or an insight really can't continue to work on you over time if it ceases to have any purchase within you as having been valuable enough to return your attention to, and to return a quality of attention that allows it to work, that allows it to blossom. And again, this goes back to why I felt your book was so refreshing, was because it felt like both explicitly and implicitly throughout the book was a sort of reminder of the deeper something that's in the midst of this whole psychedelic thing that I feel often gets sort of like lost in the conversation or the mainstream conversations these days.
Right. So I want to do a little confession here. I will send you a chapter from a book. I think it's Psychedelics and Psychotherapy. I'm one of the chapters, and I talk about this event, the Jaguar swipe, and here's what actually happened. Because I made a mistake. We were just on a walk. This is not a client. This is an interview, and we're walking and talking, and she tells me this story of the Jaguar. And she was in Utah or somewhere like that on a mountain. And my response is, I don't think the Jaguars live in that area. Totally wrong. Not only do I not know anything about Jaguars, but I missed it completely. And that kind of comment from a therapist, even just in conversation, it's not even a therapy, can shut someone down. And so I caught myself. I was a little slow on my countertransference, my know-it-all countertransference. I stopped and I apologized. And we got back on track, and then she talked more. But it's a perfect example of a therapist's mistake. And the therapist does that, and that mistake stands. It can shut the person down. It's like not watering a plant. It's not really supporting and encouraging that event to grow in her psyche. So I will send you the chapter that's in that book.
Well, no need. I have the book and I've read it. It's good. Yes.
But still, I'll send you the chapter so then it can be on your website and people can see what not to do.
It actually brings me to this part of the discussion is the idea of like being careful not to psychologize people's, or to exclusively psychologize people's psychedelic experiences. I mentioned this to somebody recently. They seemed quite offended that I would suggest that there's something wrong with psychologizing, and I'm not sure that they and I were on the same page of like what we were actually talking about. But as in like, I think there was some miscommunication happening. But what you just said there feels like it speaks to this concern. And again, it sort of speaks to the concern of psychedelic therapists not having their own psychedelic experiences, not having had to grapple with making sense of these experiences, and then presenting themselves as being able to support other people making sense of it. Do you have anything you'd like to offer to this idea of like being careful not to psychologize?
Yes. And I think I said in the ayahuasca book, when someone tells you a mystical experience, the only response is, oh, wow. Do not psychologize it. And and so that means you have to be able to recognize a numinous experience. So I have a friend who, here's an example of, he's early 50s, and he did, I think he took LSD home alone, which of course, horrifies me, but he had a good experience, and he wrote me a long, report of his experience. And there were two female characters in the experience. And one was clearly his mother. And the other was an archetype, a feminine archetype. A therapist has to know that these are two different realms in the psyche, and not conflate them and work with them very differently. So a mother comes up in therapy and, you work with the mother.
Yeah.
But an archetype, a female archetype comes up, and it's very, very different. It's a presence. It's, she came into me. It's very different. And that you want to nourish and support and not interpret, and not conflate the two. So the therapist has to know from their own inner work how to differentiate what's a psychological issue and what's a numinous presence and gift from the psyche. Very different.
So I feel like there's some sort of lateral connection here, perhaps, or analogical thinking just came to mind from the late Stephen Hare Buhner. Um, but there's a quite an exploration in your book about unseen realms and unseen others, like working with unseen others, getting messages from unseen worlds and plants teachers. And you do have a bit of a discussion there around, like, I don't know, like the quandary of, is it real? And what's that?
I'm making progress on this dilemma.
That aside, I'll leave listeners to read your book if they're interested in hearing how you broach this topic. But one of the other things that you mentioned, which is close to that, is in the integration phase. Assuming that you've received these messages or what have you, or you have some sort of experience that you're like, wow, this is important. How to tell the difference between this sort of like valid and helpful vision that was offered to you or revealed to you, and what is an ego projection? Can you comment a little bit on this?
I asked a shaman sort of a similar question, and it was basically, so should people just follow the advice they get from a ceremony? And he said, no. See what you get in the next ceremony. Ask the question about the advice you got. If you keep getting the same advice 2 or 3 times, then consider it. But consider it. Use your brain. Duh. It's a process of discernment where, yes, you receive from unknown sources, and you also reflect and use your brain and decide, is this a helpful thing for me and for my community? So there's both going on. Now I'd lost track of your question. Tell me again the essence of your question.
Yeah. So learning how, or if it's even possible, to clearly discern between what is this sort of like message. Yeah, go ahead.
It's sort of the art of discernment. So it's using both functions, using your intuitive function and your cognitive questioning as well. So it's an art of both. And the safety is take your time. Don't jump into anything. But I think your question was bordering on, I received a message that I should be leading ceremonies, on
Sure.
inflation.
Yeah.
And, hopefully you have someone who will tell you, to stop, chill out. Or that you'll have your own, in the traditional shamanic training, they talk about humility. And that's the antidote for that kind of inflation, is humility, is really knowing that I'm not doing the healing. The plants are doing the healing. It's coming through the plants. But this is how inflation happens.
It makes me think of, I've made this differentiation a number of times in different podcasts around the phrase psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, and how, given that basically what's happening here is they're doing therapy with people, but then they're giving them psilocybin, and on the day they're just supporting them in their journey, and then they do integration therapy afterwards. Then in my mind, it's like it's hubris to think that what's happening is psilocybin is assisting the therapy. No. The therapy is assisting the psilocybin. This is therapy-assisted psilocybin, not the other way around.
That's great. I like that very much. And there you see the two functions, that the roles of doing the therapy and doing the sitting are conflated in one person. Yeah. And if it's maybe one strong dose, then maybe it is therapy assisted. Then maybe it is psilocybin assisted therapy, because it's just one dose. But the way the medicines are used in real life, not in academic studies is the way you're describing, where the medicine is working and the therapy facilitates the medicine over time. And that's the big difference, is that it's not just one dose, but it's used over time and through a lifespan.
So we're at the tail end of our time here. And what I'm kind of hoping for is, somewhat like kind of asking for your advice. It's to different contexts. We'll see. I feel like you are very humble in your book. And I even wrote in a note, I was like, Rachel is way too humble. She is so much more awesome than she's given herself credit for. So I'm gonna like stand and be like, you're awesome. I'd like to ask you some advice-based questions if you're willing. For each different sort of in different contexts. So the first one is whatever advice based in your experiences and your work over the world and your conversations and relationships with these guides, what advice you might have for people who are right now called to become therapists specifically to provide psychedelic therapy?
I think I've said this, really. It is get as much experience as you can. And I also say, and get licensed. If you're young and you haven't done your graduate work yet, it is important to get licensed, but people don't really learn how to do therapy in graduate programs, So you really have to do a lot of other trainings and workshops and hopefully your own therapy. I refer people to Alan Shore's writing. He's not easy to read because he's summarizing a lot of neurological research, but it would be worth going to his website and at least watching some of his lectures on YouTube. And he's got a couple of books on psychotherapy, and he's got a lot to offer. The art, I think one book is the science of the art of psychotherapy, or I'm scrambling that title, but it's something like that. But Alan Shore, Schore, he's someone, I've just attended his lectures and read his books and really learned a lot from him.
Yeah, it feels like earlier we were talking about this, taking a breath in to create space in your client or something. And when I think about like what neurological research would suggest that this is kind of possible, and Alan Shore's work is like, oh yeah,
yes,
he talks about this kind of thing as being right in the neurobiology of it. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna ask a couple more advice questions now.
Okay.
But I'll ask them one at a time. So the next one is for presently established therapists who don't really have any psychedelic experience, but are looking to incorporate psychedelics into their therapy practice.
Develop a 5-year plan. Don't do this in 5 months or next year. And actually, a very experienced, well-trained therapist just did contact me and ask me that same question. And because I'm not going to refer her to any underground people, I told her to go to meetings of a psychedelic society in her area and begin to make connections in that community and begin to get experience. But think of it as a 5-year plan.
I'm going to addition to this, because one of the things that is immediately available, like from what I understand, like if I were a medical doctor or a licensed therapist, it would be very easy for me to, within the next couple of months, have the necessary certification to deliver ketamine as a psychedelic medicine. Any comments on that? Because likely that's going to be the first place therapists are able to start providing psychedelic therapy is through ketamine.
Yes, and they need to know that ketamine is not really a psychedelic, it's a dissociative. So I don't think what you learn on ketamine is applicable to working with the entheogens. I think it's a different territory. And yes, that is a way to get a job and get experience in altered states. And you can I think you go to a week-long in-person ketamine training, or where you are actually given ketamine and have your own experience. But you don't develop wisdom this way. So wisdom takes time. And also, I really want to say, let's not forget, ketamine is an addictive drug, and it's not it's tricky. So it's not, it doesn't have sort of the wholesome intentions of the plants that really want to help us. It's a drug, and it's a very tricky drug. So I've already heard of a couple of psychedelic therapists overdoing ketamine and doing too much of it.
Yeah, I think for myself, yes, thank you. For myself, I the term addictive drug shifts when it's more like it has a high abuse potential.
Okay.
Right? Because it isn't necessarily addictive to take it, but it is, in my experience and in like speaking with others, there's an inclination within it that it is very easy to accidentally find yourself in an addiction with ketamine. But that ketamine itself is not addictive. But I think for myself there, it's
That's
just like,
good correction. Thank you.
wondering, what is an addiction, and is an addiction different than physiological dependence? Right. And like, kind of like parsing that and just saying like, yeah, dependence is an issue as well as,
right.
What's the word I just used? Abuse potential.
Yeah. Thank you. Well done.
Okay. So the next one, any advice you have for people who are presently interested in becoming underground guides? They fancy themselves to sort of become maybe eventually one of the elders carrying this work.
That's very tempting, because it's a powerful position, and people are charging a lot of money for this. And if this is something you feel called to do, then do your own work first. You don't just start doing this. You do your own journeys and your own therapy using those journeys, and do that for a good bit, and then see. And in the process of doing that, you'll connect with a collegial community who will provide some training and supervision and consultation, but enter working on yourself first.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you mentioned something like people become guides by being guided. Would you have that suggestion as well?
That's exactly what I'm saying. By being guided, and also doing therapy with the journeys. And that might be two separate people. So I realize I'm talking about spending a lot of money and taking a lot of time. And I don't know a fast, cheaper way to do it.
There's no work weekend online certification I could take that. Let's
start a new business.
We'll get everyone certified. Qualification, couldn't say. Okay. 2 left. Any advice for people who are presently looking for someone to guide them? Now, this isn't necessarily how do I find the person, as in like, who is that person? But it's more like, what qualities should I be looking for to help me know that this is a person I can trust to guide me?
Well, I've talked about they should be someone who has a lot of experience. They should do a complete medical psychiatric interview. But, I also said about Leo Zeff that he was described as someone with a big heart. You want someone who has that kind of integrity and capacity in their heart. Please don't anyone contact me asking me for a referral, but I do I do know someone who has I don't know if she went to college. She certainly is not licensed. She's not a professional. She's embedded in a community of therapists, even though she herself is not a therapist. She's been working with the medicines for years now. I think I heard from her first 7 or 8 years ago, and she was already working on herself. So I've known her now a long time. And I would say this is someone I trust because, yes, she's ticked it, she's had therapy, she's done her own work with the medicines. She has a lovely heart. It's just who she is. So you have to intuitively recognize that in someone you want to work with.
Okay, last one. Any advice for people who are interested in developing a life practice with psychedelics, not necessarily for therapy?
Some of the guides really specialized in people who were already doing well in their life and just wanting to use the medicines to be more expansive, to grow, to be able to contribute more. So some of the underground guides work with well-functioning people. So it's about finding people who are working with that kind of orientation. As you become more experienced, then sometimes you develop friendships with other people, and maybe you sit for each other. That happens. Excuse me. Or, I hear stories of people on camping trips who are all experienced and they do a journey together. So people are using these medicines in a lot of different ways. And I hope our culture gets better at this and is supportive of this process that's used in many different ways, not just medicalized. I hope we don't limit the entheogens to a medicalized situation and purpose. They have bigger lessons for us and more gifts. And so I hope, we learn how to use them with respect and a sanctity about them.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rachel. I fully agree, deep, wholeheartedly. So I'll ask you about the contact links and where can people buy your book and this kind of thing in a second. But out of the conversation, is there anything that feels alive for you that you'd like to leave the listeners with as concluding remarks at all?
Well, did I already mention that the title comes from Maria Sabina? I know we touched on her through Gordon Wasson and his mycologist wife, but she's the Mexican curandera, and she would sing to people she worked with. And one of her songs was, "I am a woman who swims in the sacred." And that's where the title comes from, because the women really live not in a woo-woo world, but they live with an awareness of other realms within this concrete world. And so there's an openness to more subtle energies.
Yeah, I love the term swimming in the sacred. Wait, that's the title of your book, Swimming in the Sacred.
That's the title. Yeah.
Yeah. And increasingly, again, like the way that you would, I think, very skillfully bring things back, throughout the course of it, I felt like each time you use the phrase, I understood it more deeply. And I really appreciate it. Whether or not I fully grok it, we'll see. I think I might have a taste of it, but
but I think that's how the medicines unfold in you.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. With that, again, the title of your new book is Swimming in the Sacred. Your previous book is called Listening to Ayahuasca. Where can people buy these books? And is there any other place you'd like to send people if they want to follow your work, social media, etc.?
No, I do nothing on anything. Oh, really? It's not going to happen. The website is swimminginthe-sacred.com. So they'll find videos. There's a lot of stuff on the website.
Okay, I'll make sure that is in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. Rachel, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and learn from you. And you've written a beautiful book, and I'm just so grateful for your work and your time.
James, thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
And cut. Okay, that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please do follow up with Rachel's work. Swimming in the Sacred was a beautiful book, as you heard me speak to a number of times through the course of this interview. And her larger body of work is also just generally quite wonderful. Links to get the book will be in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, or you could just Google Swimming in the Sacred Harris, and you will find it. Rachel mentioned a number of specific, I guess, articles, pieces of content that she wanted to share. She sent those things to me, and you can head to the show notes for this episode at jameswjesso.com to get access to all of that as well, if you're interested. Finally, again, this show could not exist without the voluntary financial support of people who recognize the value they get from listening to this podcast and the work that goes into producing it, and who are able to, send back a little financial reciprocation for that value in the form of one-time donations, PayPal, Ko-Fi, or Patreon. Links to do all of that are in the description of this episode. So if you found some value, please toss me a little tip. If you'd like to stay in contact with me, I have a Telegram channel, there's a subreddit, there's a newsletter, which is a great way to stay in contact with me, and I'm on various things of social media. All of that is also in the description, or you could just search James W. Jesso, Jesso, on the internets, and you'll find me. So thanks again for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, and until the next one, take care.